Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second edition of the University of Calgary's Courageous Conversation Speaker Series, where we will be addressing the topic, what you're calling me a racist? I am Dr. Melinda Smith, Vice Provost, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of Calgary, and I'll be your host today. Thank you for joining us on this very important discussion. To begin, I'd like to acknowledge that even though we are all joining remotely, I'm confident that every single one of us is residing on the traditional territories of at least one Indigenous nation. I express sincere gratitude for being able to call these lands our respective homes. I'm located in Calgary, Canada, on the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nations and Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearpaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. My guests today are Dr. Sarita Srivastava and Dr. Fiona Nicoll. The Courageous Conversation Speaker Series is hosted by the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at University of Calgary. So this talk is part of our education awareness efforts to improve EDI literacy, including what is called racial literacy. Our first speaker this term was Dr. Alana Lenton on the topic, the racist violence of not racism and the role of academics. And the video is now available on the YouTube and the OED's website. Our speakers today are Dr. Sarita Srivastava and Dr. Fiona Nicoll, speaking on the difficult and sometimes contentious topic, what, you're calling me a racist? Which takes up the interconnected phenomenon in which those who name the problem, as British cultural studies scholar Sarah Med put it, those who name the problem stand accused of being the problem. And second, the challenge that naming racism, calling someone engaged in racism a racist is sometimes seen as more offensive than racism itself. Both of these challenges, including the ways in which discussions of racism generate wide-ranging emotions, make it difficult to have conversations about race and racism. And indeed, a number of scholars, activists, and policymakers are grappling with this fraught terrain. The context of this conversation also includes, this also influences the series and why we believe we cannot shy away from these difficult conversations. We are emerging out of a spring and summer of discontent and local and global mobilizing around for racial justice, including over the brutal deaths of George Floyd at the hands of the police in Minneapolis, and recently the death of Joyce Echawan in a Quebec hospital. Two major institutions, the police and healthcare, center our attention on institutional racism. The repetition of this racial violence, the trauma and its effect, including the recently released report by Stats Canada, highlight what's called a pandemic of grief. These mobilizations and study after study have animated a deep fatigue with the slow pace of change and have strengthened a call for concrete actions toward dismantling systems of oppression and injustice, and a call to go beyond words to action to effect transformative systemic change. So we are gathered at a moment when worldwide we are also hearing renewed calls for greater attention to the social, to issues of fairness and especially to racial justice. This series is called Courageous Conversations because it builds on and amplifies similar conversations, variously called courageous, brave, difficult, contentious. It highlights how knowledge and EDI literacy and racial literacy are indispensable to such conversation, and in turn highlights the roles of universities and schools in this important work. In this series, we focus on courage, a quality that enables a person to confront difficulty, danger, or pain instead of withdrawing from it. Courage, as Brody notes, evokes the responsibility to unsettle the familiar, to subject dominant governing assumptions to empirical and normative scrutiny, and to expand more widely in the policymaking, academic, and community spaces, the space for divergent opinions, contrary evidence, and marginalized voices. Courage demands informed and inclusive policy debates, which give voice to social justice movements and different visions of our collective futures. The series is inspired by two women, Maya Angelou, who argued that courage is the most important of all the virtues because without courage, you cannot practice any other virtue consistently. You can practice any virtue erratically, but nothing consistently without courage. It's also inspired by local Calgarian, the late and great Violet King, who became Canada's first Black woman lawyer. Violet King said in 1956, "People told me it wasn't a good idea for a girl to be a lawyer, particularly a colored girl, so I went ahead." With the Courageous Conversation Speaker Series, people told me it might not be a good idea to go ahead with these series, so in the tradition of Violet King, I'm going ahead. These are important conversations that we need to be having. And we have with us two leading speakers who can help us to tackle these difficult and contentious topics.
So first, a huge thanks to Melinda for organising these courageous conversations. I can't imagine a more important moment to be having them. And I'm really glad to be joining everybody from Treaty 6 territories, which cover Edmonton, which is where I live and work. Donald Trump claimed during his first election debate to be the least racist person in this room, followed by the claim that he had done as much for the African-American community as Abraham Lincoln. These assertions of white non-racism and benevolence are reflexive responses to an implicit criticism that I encapsulated in 2004 in a paper titled, "Are You Calling Me a Racist?" This is a rhetorical move I may not have used 15 years later, but owning white racism as my cultural and epistemological heritage was a challenging gesture in an Australian society that was dominated by claims of post-racism and post-coloniality. It was a way to demonstrate the persistence of everyday white racism as a force that shaped my identity, even in collaborative projects with Indigenous people. Today, in a context of emboldened white supremacism, I feel considerable pressure to clearly identify myself as a white ally or an accomplice in anti-racist movements. Yet the epistemological problem that I faced in 2004 remains. On what grounds can I know whether I'm an ally or not? If I put a sticker on my office door to signal that I am an ally, as staff were actually encouraged to do in one Australian university, doesn't that give permission for racism and misogyny and homophobia and transphobia to thrive in the offices that are unmarked by such stickers? So rather than attaching to an identity as an ally or as an accomplice, I want to keep the focus on unraveling and removing white supremacism from the relationships and the institutions that I inhabit. Sarita's research found that white women's affects were closely linked to their sense of political and personal identity, and this often stopped necessary anti-racist work from proceeding. Her findings should caution us against too enthusiastically embracing the work of some popular academic writers who are putting powerful feelings at the centre of the transnational conversation on anti-racism and social justice. And today I'm going to provide 3 critical tools to supplement the popular work on white fragility that some of you are probably familiar with. These critical tools include the white possessive, white love, and white ignorance. Now, to illustrate the kind of fragility that I'm referring to, I'll just give two examples. Brene Brown, a qualitative social researcher who tells us staying vulnerable is a risk we have to take if we want to experience connection. And Robin DiAngelo, who explains that the antidote to white fragility is ongoing and lifelong and includes sustained engagement, humility, and education. But I can testify it is also the most exciting, powerful, and intellectually stimulating and emotionally fulfilling journey I have ever taken. And so we recognise here a certain narrative of the self, which Sarita's work is really useful for helping us to think about. Now, these kinds of statements illustrate the scope and the limits of prevailing accounts of how institutionalised racism works at the level of affect. And I want to contrast these with ways of understanding and challenging racism that are more resonant with decolonial and abolitionist activists and intellectuals. But it's important first to note that this preoccupation with difficult feelings is not limited to white women. In fact, I've found in my everyday life an increasing number of powerful white men telling me that they are also grappling with a sense of emotional vulnerability when they are challenged by decolonial epistemologies. Now, what worries me is how easily projects to realise social justice become derailed by a focus on the emotional fragility of those, the emotional fragility of lives that are in fact securitized by whiteness and patriarchy. So this I see as the problem. Now, I'm not doubting or dismissing the existential challenge that recognising one's complicity within relations of power, of which one had previously been righteously critical. But there is a problem when a focus on white people's feelings of fragility and vulnerability displaces urgent issues, including racial targeting and gross human rights abuses. In Canada, where I currently live and work, these include Black and Indigenous racial profiling, access to clean drinking water, for goodness sake, food and housing security, and systemic changes that are needed to make the lives of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit plus people safe from sexual predation and from racist, trans, and homophobic discrimination. Attending to these issues can't and shouldn't wait until the emotional fragility of white people has been overcome, one reading group at a time. Instead, white people need to accept the emotional messiness that comes with standing up to injustice against populations whose dispossession and incarceration has made our way of life possible for many generations in settler-colonial states. Aileen Moreton Robinson's account of the white possessive and Sarah Ahmed's account of the cultural politics of emotion move us beyond the cognitive and affective blocks that are installed by current discourses on white fragility and celebrations of vulnerability as the grounds of social justice and connection. So Moreton Robinson argues that whiteness is characterised by possessive logics, and she explains what these are very clearly and carefully. They denote a mode of rationalisation underpinned by an excessive desire to invest in reproducing and reaffirming the nation-state's ownership, control and domination. As such, white possessive logics are operationalised within discourses to circulate sets of meanings about ownership of the nation as part of common sense knowledge, decision-making and socially produced conventions. Note here her emphasis on an excessive desire to invest in reproducing and reaffirming the nation-state's ownership, control and domination. Ahmed's study of the feelings mobilised by participants in white pride movements found, quote, "It is the love of white or those that are recognisable as white which supposedly explains this communal visceral response of racial hate. Because we love, we hate, and this hate is what brings us together. The ordinary white subject is a fantasy that comes into being through the mobilisation of hate as a passionate attachment closely tied to love." In different ways, both of these scholars use empirical research on white people to understand the language of attachment that forges white selves as possessive of families, communities, and nation states. So putting anti-racism to work requires more than simply rejecting white supremacism as hateful. It requires us to cut away the bonds of racialized and gendered love that have created and sustained the institutions of settler colonial societies. This undoing of possessive attachments should not be confused with white guilt or white fragility, nor should it legitimise discourses of reverse racism, which opponents of critical race and intersectionality theories use to discredit academic researchers in our field. The current focus on affect and white fragility in particular may have obscured an earlier and perhaps more important focus of critical race and whiteness research. The challenge and political problem of what political theorist Charles Mills describes as white ignorance, and which is demonstrated in the phenomenon of ex-nomination or not naming. This is a well-documented and well-researched tendency of white people to see ourselves as not having a race or not being racialized. We see this in Trump's claim to be the least racist person in this room. Note he does not refer to himself as the least racist white person in this room. At the same time, he refers to the African American community as a clearly defined group that he has done so much for. I'm suggesting the key to enlisting white people to become actively involved in undoing racism may lie less in examining our feelings than in understanding how white people can understand ourselves to be just individuals, while the humanity of other people remains trapped within racial schemas that perpetuate systemic white supremacism. But is all this too academic for those of you, and I'm sure there are many of you in our audience today who are working on the ground to transform your institutions and communities at a grassroots level? I hope to show that it is not just a question of academic debate. I hope that what everyone can take away from these thinkers is the message that whiteness is an orientation towards ourselves, towards others, towards what we understand as our possessions, and towards where we believe that we belong. Anti-racism requires us to reappraise these things, to consider not only whether there is hate in our heart, but equally and perhaps more importantly, where and to whom our most fervent love is directed. It requires us to let go of our sense of exclusive and unconditional belonging to a community, to a nation, to a race, and to come to terms with the problem of white ignorance. So I'll give you a moment to look at how the political scientist Charles Mills introduces this concept. We see that, according to Mills, white ignorance is not confined at all to uneducated people. It thrives among white social elites, often in the forms of benevolent intentions combined with a failure or refusal to locate the source of our intergenerational wealth in the uncompensated labour and dispossessed lands of Black and Indigenous populations. Perhaps addressing white ignorance does not require more formal education about anti-racism or expensive corporate workshops on cultural sensitivity and implicit bias. Perhaps there are cheaper and more effective ways to recognise and challenge the possessive logics that encourage us to excessively invest in the ownership, control, and domination of settler colonial nation states. So reflections on my experience in the classroom and working with Indigenous people on projects in Australia and Canada have brought me to understand the value of art as a meta language, which is like a language about language. It helps to keep white people, I think, moving along anti-racist paths. Certain artworks, particularly those that are unbound from confines of commercial and state-sponsored exhibitions, contain a conceptual and sensory force that is needed to move us from fragility to fierceness in the relational work of undoing the white possessive. Such works can show us how we see. They can speak to us of the ways that we speak. They rethink what we think we know already about politics, race, and culture. Importantly, they can slow us down. They arrest us as we are rushing along the path to solving problems that we often do not fully or clearly understand. They invite new ways of thinking and different ways of feeling about these problems and our place within them. Having presented ways of thinking about race and whiteness that don't require coming to terms with a tenuous sense, and I might even say a disingenuous sense of vulnerability or fragility, it's nevertheless important to acknowledge, as I did in 2004, that racial schemas of classification and possessive logics of the self are part of my intergenerational heritage, and they don't shake loose easily. So when I look at works like these by Métis artist David Garneau from Canada and Aboriginal artist Fiona Foley from Australia, I'm invited to think twice. I'm invited to experience feelings that aren't easy to catalogue or to translate into diversity capital. I might experience recognition strangely. I might feel, particularly with this piece by Fiona Foley, The Hedonistic Honky Haters, I might feel like laughing nervously or boisterously. I might feel my grounds of understanding what racism is, what whiteness is, begin to shift slightly, subtly. I might feel a sense of what the Australian Indigenous sovereignty theorist Irene Watson describes as watching you, watching me. And I should actually just do a really quick corrective there and say that I'm describing Fiona Foley to an audience that I'm imagining is particularly in Canada, but she's her nation is Bachelor. So she's a Bachelor woman, and Irene Watson is the Nurrungeri. So the names of Australia intellectuals have been imposed by that nation state structure. In the final minute or so before we move into Sarita's talk, I just wanted to invite all of you who are with us here to reflect on the kinds of courageous conversations that might be sparked by the way that you see and feel these images.
Okay, so the title of my talk is You're Calling Me a Racist, The Emotional Landscape of Racial Encounters. I just begin by talking a little bit about diversity itself, which is, it's become such a common focus of training. It's become an industry, it's become a policy initiative, it's become a buzzword. And but my question, as I began with last time, is this question of why then do these diversity efforts falter, even in the most well-meaning of organizations, even among progressive folks? Equity and diversity efforts often fail, or they lead to conflict. And precisely in the places where we most expect them to succeed, they falter. And why is that? And one of the things I found, my own research is based on interviewing people inside these organizations who've brought in facilitators who are having anti-racist workshops, and when I interviewed them and talked about why is it failing, then one of the key dynamics that they pointed to is the emotional. And so I've come to call this dynamic feel-good racial politics. And I argue that the failure of diversity efforts can be traced to our emotional and our moral preoccupations. The desire to feel good, warm, comfortable, and also to feel that we are good, to feel that we are morally good people, that we're upstanding, that we are not racist. And that I argue that these feel-good racial politics, that they shape our political debates about racism, they shape our professional workplace lives, and they even shape our intimate attachments. And what they do is also then limit our ability to focus on concrete practices, which could move us forward. I'm not against emotions. I'm not against people feeling good about themselves or doing therapy or inner work. The question that I ask is, where does that lead us to in terms of moving towards equity or moving towards diversity? And in fact, how does it often mislead us or distract us? And some simple examples that are not necessarily organizational or university examples, but to illustrate this point is Blackout Tuesday that happened in June of this year. Social media was flooded by millions of people posting Black squares. And we asked the question, did this promote the cause of Black Lives Matters or not? And I think most people know the answer, that actually what happened was the Black Lives Matter feed got flooded with images of Black squares. So, and I don't bring this up to mock or to point fingers at or to criticize people that felt that they were doing good by posting the Black square, but rather to ask this question about how did this happen or why did this happen? We could do many critiques about how it was a failure of organizational practice, people use the wrong hashtag and so on. But it's a trend, I think, that points to something that happens on a larger scale in organizations, which is we often do the thing that makes us look good or feel good in the moment, rather than asking bigger and deeper and sometimes smaller questions about what is it that we're actually trying to change and what's the best way to change it. Another example is the hashtag I'll ride with you, which was something that, again, another very successful social media campaign. There were 300,000 tweets in just, sorry, I'm not sure if my screen's up or not. I'm looking at my own slides. Maybe someone can, it says I have control of the screen. Anyone? Okay, I'll just keep going.
The slides are up and they are on page 1.
Okay, so they're on page 1. So why can't I see that? Let me switch here because I'm on my slides. Okay, they're on page 1. So let me go back to Zoom then. Oh, here we are. Okay, got it. Okay, so now, but then I should be able to take control of this, right? You can control your viewing. How do I control this? Click to start the remote control. Click what? Click. Is this it? Can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. No, it doesn't work. It's not. It says I'm controlling it, but there we go. Okay, this is my questions that I've already asked. Let's move through them. Let's move through them quickly. Feel good racial politics, the desire to feel good and feel that we are good. And Blackout Tuesday, here we are. Okay, here's I'll Ride With You. So another social media campaign in which there were 300,000 tweets in just 4 days, people offering to protect Muslim commuters from racial violence. It started in Sydney, Australia. This is the images of someone putting this sticker on their bag in the subway to let people know, I'm here in case you're fearing racist violence. I'll walk with you. I'll ride in the subway with you. The question is, did anyone actually take up a ride? And one of a Sydney residents says, despite repeated callouts, he was unable to find a single Muslim who took up the offer to ride with anyone. And yet it was seen and touted as an overwhelming success because it demonstrated how the goodness of people around the world and how willing they were to stand up against racism and to help each other. And again, I don't want to say that those people didn't experience those sentiments, didn't genuinely want to help. The question is, what does that kind of sentiment produce in terms of change? And what kinds of actions do we find ourselves putting lots of energy into when the sentiment is about how to do good rather than how to make change? And in both these cases, the Black Lives Matter and the I'll Ride With You case, one of the reasons why these efforts went awry is because there wasn't connection to the communities. So in this case, I'll ride with you, as Osman Faruqi says. I think if you ask most Muslims, how would we like you to help you? They wouldn't say, put out a popular hashtag. There was no consultation with the community in terms of how is it that we can work on Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racial violence in Australia or globally. A bigger conversation. So why is it then, to come back to this question, why is it that diversity efforts falter? And my broader answer to this is that these pedagogical, moral, and emotional preoccupations. One is that, as Fiona talked about, we see racism as this moral flaw, the sign of ignorance, as a personal trait. You're evil or you're good. And that leads us to this idea that racism arises from ignorance, that therefore we should reform it through education, through workshops. And often those workshops then rest on this historical shift that has moved us towards examining ourselves in terms of becoming better people, self-examination as an ethical practice, so that anti-racism itself becomes seen as a route, to improving oneself, as a key to a more ethical self. And we become, people become attached to their own moral identity as progressive and anti-oppressive. So all the efforts around education, conversation are focused on how to be a better person or to be a good person. And it's a trap that's very difficult to get out of if racism is seen as a personal trait, an individual trait, and a sign of evil. Some examples, then this takes us to talking and conversation and discussion and feelings as a pedagogical strategy, where we focus on correcting ignorance, teaching people, what does racism look like? What does an experience of racism like? What is a microaggression? Rather than on creating new knowledges or new equity practices. So this is training, facilitation, workshops, self-reflection, policies that are in various ways that that are symbolic displays of diversity, rather than looking carefully, locally at the systemic, everyday practices that could be challenged. So there's millions spent on anti-bias training and diversity workshops. Starbucks spent $12 million just on one afternoon of anti-racism training after there was one reported incident in which they called the police on a customer. You may remember that. Robin DiAngelo, who's has this best-selling book, White Fragility, is now, even since the summer, in very high demand. But even before this summer, past summer, she was doing reportedly about 10 workshops a month at about $15,000 each. So there's a lot of demand for this kind of training and diversity workshops, and yet are they effective? You know, in her, she says some very similar things in her book to that Fiona and I are saying, which is when racism is brought up in organizations, people get emotional and defensive. And yet in her last chapter, when she says, where do we go from here as a solution, she suggests that people focus on therapeutic practices, that they shift their emotion, that they learn to apologize better, that they reflect, that they try to have different feelings. And this is my concern, is that because this approach has not only continued to be popular, but has become even more popularized since the spring of 2020, that we need to challenge it. This is just, again, what I've spoken about before, the emotional responses that arise out of this kind of workshop approach. This is just a couple of excerpts from my interviews. This is one woman who's worked in many community organizations and talks about one kind of emotional response, which is the indignance, the anger, the tears, the sort of denial and resistance. She says it's in every single organization that she's been in. And then there's a different kind of response, which is a moral preoccupation that I've talked about, which is seeing anti-racism as a key to the self. So she talks about this fear of being called racist, which I think is very common and motivates a lot of people's actions. I think this in a very everyday way. And she says, it's really hard for me to reflect on where I was, but that's where I was too. I used to be afraid of being called racist, more afraid of being called racist than anything else. And now if someone were to say that, I would say, you're probably right. So this is seen as the goal of anti-racism, this moral progression. First, I used to be afraid of being called racist. Now I can say I am racist. And because I can say that I am racist, therefore that shows that I'm not racist. And so the preoccupation, the focus is still on oneself, on the individual and the individual's ethical or moral progression. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't work on themselves from an ethical perspective, or emotional perspective. I believe in that very strongly. My concern is, how is it that then becomes connected to organizational strategy? So here's another example. It's like doing any of your own work. If you know that by looking at them, you're going to feel better, then you're more likely to look at them than to keep the door shut. Again, she's trying to advocate for anti-racist work in her organization by saying people should look at the ghosts in their closet. Again, it's work about the individual, the self. What I want to highlight is that this, although introspection, dialogue are all important activities, that more knowledge about racism, more introspection, more training, more changing of attitudes doesn't necessarily lead to equity. In fact, in some cases, it may even impede equity. It's not just that it's not doing enough. Sometimes it actually works against it. And I think the first two examples I showed give us a hint of that. But inside organizations, we can see there are several studies that show how this works. So for example, Jane Ward studied queer community organizations, and these were organizations that actually had made some strides in terms of hiring, bringing in people into the organization, trying to work towards diversity, were even seen as leaders in this area. And yet when she interviewed those people that had been brought into the organization on diversity efforts, she found that the conventional diversity efforts that they were undertaking, like diversity days, actually just confirmed for people the organization was normatively white. It didn't actually decenter the way that things were normally done. And studies show that, recent studies, that anti-bias corporate training actually, as time goes on, has little effect on workplace attitudes or equity. And on the contrary, studies actually show that sometimes by taking that training and knowing the right thing to say and how to present themselves as anti-racist or non-sexist, people who have established their credibility as non-sexist or non-racist, are actually more likely to make hiring decisions that discriminate against women or racialized minorities, because they feel very confident that they're not racist or not sexist, that they feel comfortable in making those kinds of decisions based on, supposedly credentials, for example. So the question then is, how can we, and I'll warn you, I don't have a universal answer, but I think it's important to ask these questions. How then do we do this work towards decolonization equity in ways that are more than symbolic? And the broader answer I have is that these efforts have to be linked to organizational practices and practices that address systemic inequities. And sometimes those are not necessarily large-scale practices. It means work that we have to do by looking at the specificities of our own space and place. So I don't have universal answers like everybody must hire this many people and do it in this way. It's actually something that has to be done collectively in a community. So we have to do it in communities of connection and mutual support. And we have to know that our practices must continue to evolve. So there was, many places have equity hiring practices in place, for example, and decided, okay, we need to bring in a person of color in our organization, for example. And then we've discovered that without support, without any follow-up, without changing the organization in any other way, without changing the kinds of knowledge that we produce, the kinds of way that we do other things, that those strategies are not enough. And in fact, in many cases can fail if we don't think about them. And so we have to continue to evolve our practices. So that means then an equity workshop, if we have an equity workshop, should be a place to get that work done. Actually, to look, rather than introspection, to look at ourselves, to look at our attitudes, to teach people about what racism looks like, and so on, or what is the experience of people of color, and so on. It should actually be a place to pinpoint and document the practices that reproduce inequality in our organization or in the place that we're at. Creatively brainstorm new practices, whether that's in recruitment or evaluation, in program, in curriculum, discuss strategies and action plans that we actually take forth these and cement these new practices, not just say we are going to do this, but actually look closely at practices to understand how is that going to shift going forward. My last slide is just an example from a program at my university, OCAD University. This is a creative writing program. And I think this is an example of the kind of practice, rather than talking about how could we be less racist, to think about how do we take what we're doing as a program in the classroom with students and connect it to anti-racism, to racial justice. So this is an installation of students in the creative writing program, an installation in Toronto called Emergence. It's one piece of it called Emergence from Emergencies, that's called Black Realities. That just was an installation this summer. So, and I think this is the kind of thing, I'm talking about, that's an alternative to thinking of universal solutions or to thinking of symbolic declarations, but actually working together with students to produce new kinds of knowledge. Thank you so much, and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Srivastava, and apologies for the technical issues, which you wade through quite gracefully, and we deeply appreciate it. That was a powerful discussion by both of you, and we have a number of questions in the chat group. But before we get to those questions, I wanted to ask you to think through what might seem like a bit of a paradox. On the one hand, you have people, you have the Trump administration, for example, and I would say a number of conservative commentators arguing against diversity training, anti-racism workshops. And they couldn't possibly imagine, I would guess, that there are people who they would see as politically, ideologically, philosophically different, also arguing against those workshops. How would you respond to people who seem to think that somehow these are strange bedfellows?
Shall I go? Yeah. I was very struck by that. I was thinking of the anti-censorship debates of old, thinking about how is it, so there's so many political debates we can think of in which people make strange bedfellows and end up in this a similar side for very different reasons. I don't think I could have imagined in my wildest dreams that we would have been saying similar things for very different reasons. So I think it's I've read that executive order very carefully, and the Trump's executive order banning anti-racist workshops. And it's interesting, it's made on the basis that people should not discriminate on the basis of race, and that anti-racist workshops discriminate by naming white people and saying that white people are a problem. So I can only say we disagree about the reasons, but I don't think that I would say that I would hope that this is an opportunity now to say, let's pause and say, what is the purpose of those anti-racist workshops, and what is it that we want to hold on to? And that maybe it's because there isn't any point in continuing in that old track if it's become so discredited on both sides, quite frankly, and that maybe it's an opportunity to say, there is something in those workshops in which white people are, the focus is on white identity and white people and white guilt and whiteness to a great degree. And instead we could use that as an opportunity now to think, why is there resistance? And is there some way that we could sidestep that resistance by saying, actually, that shouldn't be in the first place the focus of anti-racist workshops. What should be the focus is equity, justice, working conditions, and so on. And so that would be my answer, to say that perhaps, because I'm an optimistic person, perhaps there's an opportunity here. The executive order won't be effective in any case by January, but maybe it has meant that although that huge industry has had to pause to say, how do we remake ourselves to continue to be seen as acceptable? And maybe that's an opportunity for people who are having difficulty with anti-racist workshops because they see it as a corporate, like myself, who see it as large corporate industry that isn't actually forwarding the cause of anti-racist work and equity, to say, okay, so now's our opportunity to shift what it looks like. There's a reason why it created that response. It wasn't effective for anyone.
Dr. Nicoll, you're shaking your head.
You're unmute.
Yeah. Okay, I don't have a lot to add because I fundamentally agree. But I guess what I would say, I'd want to underline the research that Sarita was talking about, and which I think intuitively we know that this can just become another form of knowledge that is mobilized to discriminate in more savvy ways. I think that that is really important. I think as well that there's a very limited scope of the knowledge that those workshops engage, and the kinds of, and primarily it's psychological knowledge from disciplines, social work, psychology, which have an emphasis on the individual, which again, Sarita's presentation pointed out. And I think that the hard work on intersubjectivity, which I've been trying to get, or relationality, I've been, you know, in the research that I read, the most demanding research in critical race studies, through you know, what does it mean not to think about how do I become a less hateful person? You know, how do I show that I'm not one of those Proud Boys? But how do I understand the things that I've been told to love? How do I understand those difficult conversations at the dinner table, which as a white person, you know, I'm called to? How do I understand? I'll give an example, like, I'm involved in a land-based knowledge relation project with Cree elders and Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers on Treaty 6 territories. And part of that is using ceremony to understand things that are really difficult about relationality. I was invited to attend a sweat lodge, with the first and the only time I'd done that. And we're all sitting around, you know, waiting for the rocks to warm up. And I was making casual conversation. And in this casual conversation, I said, oh, it's been wonderful coming to Canada. You know, I've discovered sage tea. I had not discovered sage tea. This is the language, the intergenerational language of colonialism that is speaking through me. And I don't find that the workshop provides a context for those kinds of, so, you know, what happens? People look at me with horror. You know, I'm embarrassed. I laugh, and I know that I will never do that again, right? And I mean, that's just one example of like the white possessive in everyday life. But I think this is where I turn to art, because I think sometimes, and as interesting, Sarita, you know, giving that example again of that lit up billboard, that installation, sometimes we need to break through beyond the question of how do I improve myself? How do I keep my job? How do I, you know, deal with this diversity stuff without changing an institution, which I'm perfectly comfortable with. Thank you very much. And I think that, yeah, this is why, for really different reasons to the Trump administration, I think workshops can be a problem. And I think that there are cheaper and more effective and more direct ways to get this work done.
Thanks to you both. So there are a number of questions in the chat group, and one of them, or a few of them, gesture towards the direction you were heading. You were both heading. Dr. Nicoll, you talk about the land-based education, which is part of a kind of a decolonial approach to education, and Dr. Shrivastava, you were also highlighting the need to kind of decolonize equity, diversity, and inclusion work. So there's this question about the weight or how you think about decolonize or diversify or decolonize. So one of the questions is about how we move more in that direction, given in particular that the role of universities, it's not about knowledge sometimes or people needing more workshops. Rather, people are highly knowledgeable. So how do you deal with the resistance of very knowledgeable people and very aware people, this is not unconscious, to this kind of work? And particularly the questions are coming, there are a number of Indigenous and racialized scholars asking about the strategies to confront this work and maybe what's necessary from an institutional point of view as well.
May I?
Sure.
Yeah.
So my son has just come in from school, so I'm also distracted. I think the question here is one of leadership. The answer is how do you, I understood your question to be, how do you deal with the resistance from very knowledgeable people? And the question, the answer, of course, is that the answer is not to say, well, they need better knowledge or more knowledge, or we need to challenge their knowledge. Sometimes the answer is we need leadership and we need an agreement in our community that this is the way to go forward. You can't have one without the other. You can't just say, oh, the answer is coming from above. We have new leadership, the leadership says. We also have to have key people within our community that say we are moving forward. And we can't bring everybody, actually. We can't wait till everybody says, yes, I agree, this is a way to go. There are always going to be people that say, I think the schools are just fine segregated the way they are. Or, I'm happy with the way our curriculum is in its traditional art history knowledge. It's important. So there's always, you want to work together in a democratic way. I'm not saying you trample over people, but there's also a way in which you focus on a shift in practices without waiting to change everybody's heart. If you agree as a community, if you have strong leadership, you start to move forward. And I think sometimes that there is a relationship between those two things. Sometimes the resistance is based on an unwillingness to let go of our very strong positions of as knowledge leaders or as leaders and so on. And sometimes it's simply that those interests are not necessarily material, they're deeply cultural, and they will shift as the world shifts. So I think sometimes the changes have to precede people's attitude changes. We've seen that so often, that sometimes rapid changes can happen in society and people look around and go, oh, that gender neutral washroom thing wasn't so dangerous as I thought it was going to be. For example, and we don't wait till everybody agrees that that's a good thing before we actually decide it's the right thing to do for justice. So if we have strong people in leadership, we're able to make those changes, quite material changes, policy changes, practical changes, and that's, I don't have the answer, but that's one of my answers. Thank you,
Dr. Nicoll.
Yeah, I think again, I agree, and I think going back to, I would say, an excessive focus on changing hearts also, it has implications for the idea, okay, so you're changing from being this kind of person to another kind of person. And there's a voluntarism in that. And opt-in, I think the issue of opt-in kind of approaches by institutions are that they license others to behave in ways that continue to be violent, unacceptable, and to prevent institutions from being open to those who belong there. And so when I gave this example, again, it was an actual program. It was primarily to address homophobia in a university where people put rainbow stickers on their offices, literally. And I found that upsetting for a variety of reasons. But I think either the leadership is there, that says there is zero tolerance for a view that this institution belongs to those people who profess that there is a canon of knowledge that is more thoroughgoing, more objective, more scientific than the other knowledges that have been plundered, that have been discarded, that have been discredited in order for our institutions to be the way that they are. And in that sense, the project of decolonisation is a project that, if it doesn't impact everyone, if it becomes like an identity choice, yeah, well, I'm a decolonial kind of a person, I'm an ally, I'm an accomplice. I don't see, it's almost like that individual trajectory moves in an opposite direction of the social trajectory. And I think perhaps one of the things we can begin to do is, this is all of us, is insist that EDI policies, and I want to thank Melinda for doing such an incredible job in like producing this for the University of Alberta. Like these are documents that require everybody's buy-in, because these are what the institution is saying that it is. And I think having a practice in the everyday where, yeah, okay, the institution says this, but hey, I decide to opt out. I don't think opting out is I think that it is unethical and to opt out of the considerations that have been brought by so many people who actually belong in the institution. I don't think you can opt out of that.
Two more interrelated questions. Thank you for that. Relate to how we take up internalized racism on the one hand among racialized and say Indigenous peoples, but then also how you see, one question is, what are your thoughts on prejudice and racism within communities of people of color, and how emotions play into those?
Okay, I might just start to say that sometimes this is brought up, and it's brought up in conversations, and it's commonly said, okay, humans are racist. Why are we worrying about this issue of decolonisation when this is how civilizations have always been this way. Humans have an innate propensity to other one another. So therefore, why are we having these conversations? And I think that's why we need to understand the structures that have produced the institutions that we're part of, and that certain populations have, these institutions have been made for those populations. These institutions have served these populations. And that's why I think when that comes up in institutions, I think we have to say, well, okay, this might be a debate that's happening in certain academic circles, but it is not addressing the problem that we are facing within this institution here and now, which is, and then we go back to, the issue at hand. That's what I would say.
Well, I have two things to say. One is that internalized racism is just one manifestation of an experience of racism, as is any expressions of racism, whoever expresses them. It just highlights that we need to talk about, as Fiona says, as a systemic issue rather than an individual. On the other hand, in terms of understanding it as a social and historical phenomenon. But on the other hand, I do think it's important to think about if we are trying to support, for example, diversifying our institutions, bringing in people who have been underrepresented in leadership or as knowledge producers and so on, that we do think about the fact that sometimes those people don't see themselves as leaders because of the effects of on racism, not only on the people that are assessing them, but on how we assess ourselves. So, a young woman may not see herself as a political leader because she doesn't have examples. It's a very straightforward example. And so in thinking about how then do we support people, our students, our faculty, and so on, people in the community, to think up to recognize that that's a piece of it, to recognize that people do need that kind of individual level support. That is a place in which a time when individual attention makes sense. So it's not the individual of looking internally and saying individuals are the problem, but to understand that there's a way in which individuals to be encouraged to take a position of leadership in order to diversify organizations, that we do need to be attentive to the effects of racism sometimes on individuals. And that is, for example, a practice or a strategic practice that an organization or university could decide to take up in terms of what of its strategies. We should, if we bring in students of color, if we bring in faculty of color, if we bring in leaders, we need to have ways to support them, provide them resources, provide them mentorship. So I think that's where the answer to that question comes in, is to think of it as, again, on the systemic level, and think of it in terms of practice. How do we understand that as an effect, a pattern of systemic effect, and how do we challenge it?
Thanks. So just following up on that, there are two questions again that I would connect. One relates to this question about institutions that seek to effect change around equity, diversity, inclusion, but are themselves, the leadership who are tasked with doing this work, are themselves not diverse. And what challenge does that present for moving forward? What obstacles or what possibilities? But the second question relates to, again, universities or organizations or institutions, like what are effective interventions for combating racism, especially given that these are institutions, again, where the leadership and the mechanisms for these kinds of work might not be well developed. So what advice do you give to people who have these questions?
Well, I don't think that should be an impediment. I'm not sure exactly what's the reason behind the question, but certainly if the leadership is not diverse. Am I muted?
So one of them is the whole data question. Universities leadership, whether it's from, so you're thinking of Genevieve Fuji Johnson's work, or even the Diversity Gap work, or Universities Canada research to 2019 shows that Canadian universities are marked by leaderships from chairs to presidents are marked by not very diverse. And certainly racialized minorities and Indigenous peoples are notable for their absence. Yet these same institutions are called upon to change themselves, and what might be obstacles for people who are in those positions, who might even think they're there by basis of merit or excellence, to actually affect change, which may see less of them in those positions. That's one kind of questions. But the other is about people who experience racism, and in institutions where, again, there isn't a diversity of leadership who might be responsive, and then what is to be done? Not easy.
I mean, I think for the first question that you ask, I think that there is no reason why those people in the leadership can't make a commitment to change. I think this is it's been studied that this is a response that people have to not acting, which is that it's not my place. As a white person, for example, or I want the leadership to be from people of color, or so on. And I think there are ways in which that can sometimes lead to no action at all for many, many years. I think if one decides to be committed, then one is committed. It's not and leadership in these universities turns over. It's built into the governance structure, actually, that people have terms that vary from 3 years to 5 years. I know, people say universities move at a glacial pace, but I think we've seen in the pandemic that universities can also move very quickly. And I think we have examples in which which universities have been historically not very diverse and have been able to change. And I would say in my institution is one example in which all the deans in my university are now Indigenous or Black or people of color. And so I think and that's happened over a short period of time. So I think when there's commitment from the leadership, those things can happen. And it's getting to a place of, as the second part of the question, which is how do you if you're not in the leadership and there is no commitment from the leadership, and that's where and that's what's been happening over the last 50 years, which is that we know that these changes don't originate from the top, they originate with social movements. And that continues to be part of the answer, which is that we didn't see changes in leadership before we had the civil rights movement, before we had the feminist movement. That's where those changes and those challenges have originated. Students have continued to be active. So that's still part of the answer, that all the change cannot come from the administrative and academic leadership, and it rarely has. We see some very good examples. We have some very good models of universities. I'm talking about universities because that's, I think that your question was related to that, but that we have examples of that, of universities that have worked to produce comprehensive equity plans down to what does recruitment look like when we hire. For example, it's not enough to say we welcome diverse candidates, or we are going to, it's not enough. You actually have to pay close attention to the recruitment strategy and to the questions, even in the interview, and to the interview practice and process. So we do have examples of that. But of course, we have examples of institutions and organizations which maybe appear to be well-meaning on the surface. They may not be actively resistant, but for some reason, haven't felt the impetus for change. And I do think that there is a moment this spring and summer where we have seen some sudden shifts in those sorts of spaces in which people, and it ironically, because of exactly the dynamic that I talk about in my research, people realize now we cannot continue with that on that track. We have to present ourselves as fighting and working towards racial justice. And the people that did that and put out symbolic statements, people started to challenge and say, oh, so you support Black Lives Matter. What are you actually doing? What does your leadership look like? What does your people in your company, how many Black people do you have? And for a more effective statement started to come after that, which was, well, we have about 30% of our workers are women. We have 15% people of color. We have one Black person, in our whole organization, and that kind of data and that kind of scrutiny is what has started to happen as people are. So in some ways, the initial impetus of having to present oneself as in support of racial justice has provided this opening then for people to ask questions, to say, so what are the practices then attached to that? So I guess that's, I think, another example in which the work of a social justice movement, or racial justice movement in this case, has been starting to have some shift in actual practices. So that goes beyond the symbolic. So it starts with the symbolic. I think, maybe 4 years ago, 50% of people thought racism was a problem. In a study in a poll of the US, and by the spring of 2020, 80% of people recognize that racism are willing to say racism is a problem. So that beginning moment of recognition is the opening. It's just the first step, the opening for perhaps a shift in practices. So it's not to say that it's not a shift in knowledge. It's a shift in cultural acceptance that's been brought about by a social movement, that people always knew that racism was a problem. They weren't comfortable with saying it was, partly because that makes you sound like that, therefore you live in a racist world, or you might be racist, or you said something that's like you're not supposed to say. You mean shows that you're not colorblind if you recognize it or something. So that shift alone, I think, has been significant, but it's not enough. So I think that's a very long answer to your question about what do you do? And I guess my answer is, yeah, we continue to do the work outside the institutions as well.
Dr. Nicoll, did you want to respond to that, or you want to take another question?
Yeah, just pretty quickly, I think, because I think, yeah, you've covered it in great detail and necessary detail. So I'd just say that it's important to understand that when you have got a really heavy white management structure, that this is an exclusive culture, and for people to understand the cultural dimensions of that. As actually you, Professor Smith, have told us it's really important through your data, not to use middle-class white women as a proxy for, our representation as a proxy for all other kinds of diversity. I also think that it's their responsibility to seek out those people within the institution who are diverse and are experts on these issues, and to educate themselves, and then to work out when it is time for them to leave, and how they can prepare a path for others who should be a leadership path for others who would be better managers of a non-exclusive institution.
Two other interrelated questions. Well, actually, they're not interrelated, but I want to juxtapose them together. One question asks, how do you deal with a professor in a classroom who tells a racialized student that when they raise questions of racism, that they are projecting and consistently shuts down such conversations? That's on the one hand. And then there's another question that says, is it possible to that some claims of racism are false, and how you distinguish between false claims of racism, people being in denial that racism exists, and just instances of white ignorance and so on. So one is
they're easy questions, Melinda.
Well, thank our audience.
Thank you, audience.
When you say, how do you deal with the professor? Who am I? Am I the student, or am I the so colleague? Or
racialized students, I mean, I would suppose the person posing the question wants to know how do you deal with a professor that shuts down such conversations and tell them they're projecting? And then there's the other scenario that we have been confronting over the past week, which is, educated people denying racism exists. But that other question was also about, are some accusations of racism just false?
It's interesting because I think this comes down to the same problem of we are continually individualizing this. And so because we don't have enough work that's happening in institutions that looks at these questions from a broader systemic direction, our mechanisms for dealing with them are always individual. So we have to look at individual accusations instead of saying, do we have a culture in which a student wouldn't have to be in a position where they're accusing a professor of racism? Like, so for example, who are we hiring? Are we hiring people if we have a vision of knowledge production and teaching that is decolonial, then we probably eventually, then that would be something that we would think about. That doesn't mean those are situations don't arise, but that isn't our primary blunt instrument, which is accusations of racism. Because of course you can accuse, any accusation could be, accurate or not accurate, or could be wrapped up in other things. If we're always in this position of looking at individual accusations of individual events, which is so much of how our system is set up in institutions around, harassment, individual grievances, individual conflict resolution, and so on, then we're always in this position of having to navigate those kinds of, and try to figure out whose word is correct here. And so I don't have an answer for solving any particular situation. I could say in all those situations, whenever that happens, I think, how does this indicate a systemic problem? So if people what's happening in a classroom that allows this kind of conversation to happen in the first place? For example, what kind of training do the professors and TAs have? What kind of code of conduct is there for not, and culture is there that individual insults and so on should be happening in the classroom in the first place? To say you're projecting to someone is a very personal insult. That kind of conversation, why is that kind of conversation happening in an intellectual environment in the first place? That's a psychoanalytic judgment. So I think that's really where I would take the question overall is like, yes, of course you have to deal with that moment of individual grievance anyway, in the moment, but overall in the long term, in the long view, how are we working on these bigger questions from a systemic perspective?
We are thank you so much. We just had time.
Yes, I see that.
So Fiona, did you want to make one quick comment?
Yeah, really important point. Sarah Ahmed's book on complaint is just about with Duke University Press. She gave a fantastic talk at the U of A that Melinda organised. And I don't know if you can put a link to that, Melinda, but it's just that talk. This is the most extensive study of complaint within universities as institutions, and the really detailed, careful answers to those questions are in that book. I agree with Sarita though. We have to set up classrooms where these kinds of psychoanalytic accusations are not flying around without context, because then we're not actually doing our jobs as instructors, and we're not supporting our students, and we're not making our classrooms safe for everybody.
Thank you very much. So that was all terrific, and I really appreciate the detailed and nuanced and thoughtful attention you all brought to the table. So I want to thank Dr. Srivastava and Dr. Fiona Nicoll for sharing their knowledge with us and expertise with us and participating in these courageous conversations. I want to thank all of the attendees. I think at the peak, there were over 320 or more people, and many and hundreds of whom stayed with us. A recording of today's webinar will be available to watch. It will be on YouTube and on the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion's website, and probably coming out tomorrow or something later this week. If you also valued this discussion, please keep your eyes out for other courageous conversations, which will be coming up over the next weeks and months into the 2021. So without further ado, please, I wish to thank our speakers, and I know you all could do your virtual, we can't see you, but you could do all your virtual thanks to Dr. Nicoll and Dr. Srivastava.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much for attending.
Thanks, Melinda, and thanks everyone for attending, and thanks, Sarita, for your work.
Thank you all. Thanks, Melinda.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care, everyone. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.